Hi, everyone, and thank you for your time today, for joining us as we delve into a current hot button topic, understanding and mitigating Russian cyber threats. My name is Ross Filipek. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Corsica Technologies. We know that the crisis in Ukraine certainly encompasses more than just physical warfare. Already we've seen quite a lot of cyber activity directed by Russia at targets in the Ukraine. And it's our fear that those cyber attacks are going to start to spill outside of that Ukraine target into other parts of the world. So as we go through this presentation today, we're going to talk about some great ways to help protect your organizations against this elevated threat. Right at the moment, though, we don't have any official word from US officials about any specific or credible cyber threats that are directly related to the incursion into Ukraine. We're going to be keeping an eye on that in the immediate future. But really, right now, the US government is really encouraging everybody to stay vigilant and to do what they can to make the information security programs of their organizations more proactive and less reactive. And again, we're going to talk about some great ways to do that here in this presentation. So I think most of us know that Russia has a fairly long and detailed history of launching cyber attacks, really against organizations all over the globe. We've got a snippet on the screen here. This came from the most recent US DNI annual threat assessment. It says that Russia continues to target critical infrastructure, including underwater cables and industrial control systems in the United States and in allied and partner countries, as compromising such infrastructure improves and in some cases can demonstrate its ability to damage infrastructure during a crisis. And also that Russia almost certainly considers cyber attacks an acceptable option to deter adversaries, control escalation, and prosecute conflicts. So really what this means is, if you think about over the last week or so, all of the punitive activity that the United States and the EU and other allies have taken against Russia, so all the economic sanctions and banning certain Russian banks from participating in the SWIFT network, Russia really doesn't have any commensurate level of retaliation that it can engage in, right? Really, its choices are physical attacks and cyber attacks. And, because we've already demonstrated that they've got such a long history of engaging in cyber warfare, that is really what makes this whole situation pretty tense. And so some common targets for Russian attacks historically, and we would presume these will continue to be the case. Certainly corporate networks, really, nothing new here. There have been a lot of well-documented cases in the past of Russian affiliated attackers going after companies' environments, planting ransomware or stealing data, and trying to extort those companies into paying to keep that data from being released to entities that shouldn't necessarily have access to that data. Client networks, this really refers to the networks of your customers. And this kind of dovetails into the next bullet, supplier or critical partner networks. So some of you may have fixed network connections, like point-to-point fiber circuits, or even still serial T1s, site-to-site VPN tunnels, that kind of thing, that provide always-on network connectivity between your network and the network of a third-party partner or supplier. So really the danger there is that if that supplier were to be compromised, well, now you've got this fixed network connection that could very easily become a pathway for the attacker to jump from that supplier environment into yours. So definitely something to be wary of there. Critical infrastructure sector is primarily, we think energy and water are going to be the likely targets at this time. And then platforms used by individual citizens around the world. So these are going to be the Facebooks and the Twitters and Google's and well-adopted services such as those. If we take a look at the graphic on the left side of the screen, I'm not going to go through all these in detail. I just think this is useful information to keep in mind when we're thinking about Russian advanced persistent threats, or APTs. It's not one singular group or team within Russia who is initiating all of these cyber attacks. They've got different services, and within each of those services, they've got different groups. And each of those groups historically goes after certain types of targets. So, this is really much more complicated than just saying, well, Russia is trying to hack, X, Y, and Z. There really is some fairly sophisticated organization that's happening on that side. But in general terms, for the attacker's objectives, these are really primarily going to be targeted, we think, at critical infrastructure. So I mentioned things like energy and water, third-party software. So we remember from a year ago with the SolarWinds Orion supply chain types of attacks. I've got another example of that coming up that I'll jump into. Developing and deploying custom malware, also demonstrating the ability to maintain persistent and undetected access to a compromised environment. I think a lot of times right now, when people think about cyber attacks, they think about ransomware or other very noisy types of attacks like that. I call them noisy because if you have a ransomware infection, well, everybody's going to know about it within the environment, right? You're going to see all your machines locking up and the message demanding ransom payment, so on and so forth. What we see, though, a lot of times when we're looking at these advanced persistent threats, the attackers want to do everything they can to fly under the radar. They don't want to tip their hand that they've compromised the environment. So the last thing in the world that they want to do is trigger a ransomware infection or anything like that. They want to fully compromise an environment and lay low and not be detected. And the longer they're in that environment without being detected, the longer they've got to collect potentially sensitive data and exfiltrate that out of the environment. And that if and when they do get caught, well, now they've got a persistent foothold throughout the environment. So at that point, it can be easy enough to flip the switch and launch a ransomware infection or something similar. So a very dangerous situation. Some common methods of attack that we've historically seen from Russia and other threat actors. First and foremost, sophisticated phishing attacks. And we put this one right up at the top of the list because for a number of years now, this has really been far and away the most frequently used attack vector that we've seen. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that security technology has really come a long way in recent years. And a lot of organizations have at least made some level of investment into those security technologies. Almost everybody's got a firewall nowadays. Most organizations are at least running antivirus software, intrusion prevention, some other kind of basic technical cybersecurity controls that tend to be pretty pervasive nowadays. If I am an attacker, why would I want to spend days or weeks or months trying to hack in to those environments, through those technical security controls, where instead I can just send your employees a phishing email and trick them into giving me their usernames and passwords. Once I get those, I'm just going to use them to jump in to your environment and get access to whatever I'm trying to get access to. So yeah, phishing, far and away, that's still a very commonly used method of attack. Distributed denial of service, this is where the attacker is going to literally flood our internet connection or overwhelm our servers or other resources with more network traffic than those things can handle. And in the process, that essentially drowns out all of the connections from legitimate devices. So, basically knocking the system offline at that point. Exploitation of vulnerable hardware and software. It's really never been more important to make sure you're keeping up to date on patches for not just your Windows systems, but the software applications that live on those systems, even your network infrastructure devices. So routers, switches, firewalls, wireless access points, anything that connects to the network in some way, shape, or form should be able to be patched to remediate vulnerabilities. And the longer you go without patching all of those systems, the more and more exposure that you're going to have to cyber risk. So definitely keeping up to date on patches everywhere is really critical right now. Zero-day exploits, these are exploits against vulnerabilities that the manufacturer isn't aware of. So, if an attacker, figures out how to compromise some piece of software and be able to use that to extract data, or maybe even, get unauthorized remote access into that particular server. Once the manufacturer is aware of that, they've got to scramble to develop a patch and then push that patch out and make sure everybody installs it. So a lot of dangerous opportunity for cyber attacks there. Supply chain attacks, on the previous slide, I mentioned the issue last year with SolarWinds Orion. This was a pretty well-known example of a supply chain attack, but in that particular case, the attackers managed to compromise the legitimate software update stream for that Orion software. And as part of doing that, it kind of, ironically, the organizations that were doing a good job of keeping their Orion patched and up to date, those were the ones who were most impacted by this. So certainly that is something to keep an eye on here. Password attacks, these are things like brute force password attacks and password spraying. Internet of Things, nowadays seems like just about everything can connect to the network in some way, shape, or form. We've got IP-enabled cameras and doorbells and refrigerators and washing machines. You think about all the different devices that you buy nowadays that are designed to connect to the wireless network wherever they're being deployed. Well, a lot of times those devices really aren't very well secured against cyber attack, whether it's the device itself or the web-based portal that you use to administer the device. So there's usually some pretty good opportunity for hardening those systems. They're above and beyond the default settings. Industrial control systems, or ICS types of attacks. Industrial control systems very commonly used in manufacturing and things like water treatment and other special use types of scenarios. The challenge with ICS systems is that invariably these things were built with really the sole focus on availability, right? So if you're a manufacturing facility or a water treatment facility, or some organization that's using ICS components, it's really above and beyond all else. It's imperative that these things are always up, they're always running, they're always functional to do whatever tasks they are intended to do. So what that means is, with the focus really being on availability for the systems. A lot of times other security relevant factors get overlooked. So, a lot of times you're not going to really be patching ICS components, for instance. Really, the intent is that you use other parts of your security program to protect those ICS systems. So, segmenting them off on their own parts of the network, that's a great example of that. So definitely some challenges here with ICS. So CISA, and for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a government agency who oversees cyber threats and responses to cyber threats for the US government and really the country as a whole. Their website is cisa.gov. And if you haven't taken a look at that, I highly recommend that you check them out. They've got some great resources on there. They've offered some helpful guidance here to help us persevere through these potential Russian cyber issues. First and foremost, confirm that your reporting processes are intact and minimizing coverage gaps. So really what they're talking about here is within your organizations, just making sure you've got adequate IT personnel and you've got adequate coverage on a 24/7 basis. So many times we see attackers waiting until 2 or 3 in the morning, times when they know that there really aren't going to be a lot of personnel available who can step in to contain a cyber attack and remediate from recover from that cyber attack. So really the CISO guidance here is to just make sure from a capacity planning standpoint, you've got adequate personnel to be able to protect your organization against any cyber attacks that may surface within your environment. Second, create, maintain, and exercise an incident response and resilience and continuity of operations plan. So these are typically what we call an incident response plan and a business continuity plan. These are both very important documents to have. The incident response plan is going to really get into the meat of exactly what are we going to do as an organization on a step-by-step basis to contain a cyber threat that surfaces in our environment. How are we going to investigate that threat? How are we going to eradicate that threat from the environment? And then how are we going to recover from that security incident? So it's always advisable to think about those processes ahead of time and get them documented so that if an incident ever really does occur, now you're not scrambling to figure out, okay, what do I do next? You've got a well thought out plan of action that you can follow. And of course, it's always important on a periodic basis to test that incident response plan. A lot of organizations will do things like tabletop exercises, like these mock scenarios where they'll sit down and say, well, let's say we've got a ransomware infection. Step one, what are we going to do? And kind of work with all of the stakeholders to go through that process just to make sure everybody's aware of their responsibilities and what they need to be doing in the event that a security incident is occurring. All right, here we're going to talk about some specific steps that your organization can take to improve your cybersecurity posture, especially in the wake of the current situation. So in terms of being able to strengthen your identity and access guards, really what this refers to is being able to make sure that your legitimate users are being authenticated in a manner that is strong, and also being able to control exactly what they're allowed to access in terms of corporate resources. So far and away, the thing we recommend most often here, multi-factor authentication for all users without exception. This is most important for any publicly accessible systems. So for those of you who are using cloud-based services, things like Microsoft 365, for instance, a lot of organizations are using M365, being able to require multi-factor authentication for all user logon is a great protective control. Because that's a cloud-based service. I mean, there's literally nothing to stop, somebody in Russia or China, anywhere else in the world from sitting there all day long trying to break in to one of your users' email accounts, for instance. So if we require multi-factor authentication, even if the attacker phishes our user and gets his or her username and password, well, when we require MFA to back that up, we are doing a good job of protecting that user's account from unauthorized access, requiring strong passwords and not allowing those passwords to be used across multiple accounts. So strong and unique passwords, enforcing the principle of least privilege. What this really refers to is making sure that the privileges that are assigned to all of our users' accounts exactly match the privileges that they actually need in order to get their job done, right? So in general, we don't want to have all of our standard users running around with administrative privileges on their machines, right? And chances are they don't need to have administrative privileges in order to get their day-to-day work done. We want to reserve the administrative privileges only for the IT personnel or other employees who actually need them. And the reason we say that is because if I'm a standard class user and let's say I've got local administrator rights on my machine, for example, if somebody, an attacker, manages to send me a piece of malware or trick me into clicking something where I'm downloading a piece of malware, or even if I'm just browsing the web and I happen to go to a page that on which there's been a malicious advertisement that slipped in to you guys go to the the websites with the streaming ads all over the place. Attackers commonly use those to try to deliver malware to end users' machines. So a lot of opportunity there for me to inadvertently pull a piece of malware off the web down onto my machine. Now, if I've got administrative rights, guess what? That's all the privileges I need to be able to install malicious programs. Whether I know that I'm doing it or not, it can be happening in the back end, just using my administrative credentials. But it's just really important to limit those administrative rights because that really shrinks our attack surface when we do that. Similarly, creating non-privileged accounts for our privileged users. So this is commonly referred to as separation of duties. And this is really a powerful control that we have available to us as an organization. So a minute ago, I mentioned the danger of allowing our standard users to have administrative rights. But chances are we probably have some IT personnel who need administrative rights to do their IT administrative functions. But what we can do for them is make sure they have two accounts, right? One would be their standard user account, and that's the account that we want them to use for doing day-to-day tasks like composing email and browsing the web and creating Word docs and whatever their day-to-day non-administrative type job duties are. We want to be using the account with lower privileges. And then we want them only to use the second account, the administrative account, when they're actually doing things that actually require administrative rights. And as soon as they're done with those tasks, get out of the administrative account, go back to using your standard user account. Address vulnerability and configuration gaps. So CISO recommends that organizations engage in vulnerability scanning. These are generally going to be recurring automated types of scans that sweep across the network. And their purpose is to identify any systems that are connected to the network that have fallen behind on where they need to be for patching. So it's also a great way to corroborate that your automated patch management system is working as intended. reviewing system configurations for misconfigurations and security weaknesses. We all know that when we get a new laptop or really any piece of technology equipment, there are going to be a lot of different configuration settings that we can adjust within those systems. The default settings aren't necessarily the most secure. Right, so there's usually pretty good opportunity in most environments to do some additional configuration hardening to help protect those systems against cyber attack. And Center for Internet Security, for those of you who are familiar with that, that's really a great resource for very concrete guidance about ways to go about hardening really all the commonly used types of operating systems and applications. Creating and maintaining and reinforcing policies and procedures. A lot of times I think this step gets overlooked, but this is talking about, as an organization, making sure we develop information security policies that are relevant to our environment, and then also making sure that all of our employees are aware of those things and they understand and acknowledge them. Next, we've got some monitoring and detective and preventative controls for 24/7 by 365 security. So first and foremost, managed detection and response software, or MDR software. This you can think of as next generation antivirus. The great thing about MDR is that it allows us to detect so much more than just malware. Recently, so many of these cyber attacks really don't make use of malware at all. Right? So in cases like that, traditional legacy antivirus is really powerless to stop those types of attacks. So the great thing about MDR is it allows us to have visibility into behaviors of systems, in addition to the looking for the traditional malicious files. Security information and event management. This is a great way for us to be able to automatically collect and analyze the logs that are coming from things like our servers and firewalls and Microsoft 365. You think about all the different types of devices that you have connected to your networks. Well, most of these things are capable of providing some very useful logging information that can uncover a latent cyber threat that's in the environment. So the only way we can discover that is if we take advantage of those logs and do a good job of collecting and analyzing them. That's what that SIEM does for us. Vulnerability scanning, we already talked about. Secure web gateway is a really nice way to make sure that our users cannot connect to servers and domains that are known to be malicious. So a great way to make sure that we don't have a malware infection taking hold of the environment is just to keep our users from connecting to those malicious domains to begin with. Automated patching, we talked about already. Periodic security awareness, training and testing. We've actually got another slide next for that. So if we can go to the security awareness training and testing, this I think is really a powerful thing that organizations can do to really shore up their information and cyber security posture. What we're getting at here is the fact that nobody innately knows necessarily how to spot attacks like phishing emails and other types of social engineering attacks, right? Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned a lot of organizations have actually done a pretty good job of investing in technical security controls. So you got your firewalls, you got your antivirus, so on and so forth. That's great, but if you're in a position where you have employees who haven't been trained about how to spot a phishing email or a social engineering attack, there is a very real chance that those employees are now the weakest link in your security posture, right? So an employee could let the attacker right around all of those technical controls that you've deployed. So that's really why it's important to get a periodic and recurring and detailed security awareness training regimen in place for your organization. These things don't have to be cumbersome. You don't necessarily have to tie people up for hours at a time with this material. In fact, most of the training material that's out there nowadays are short, maybe 10 or 15-minute online courses that employees can take when they've got time to do this. So we always recommend that you develop a program like that, require it for all employees. Secondly, we want to test our employees' comprehension of that material by doing things like recurring fish tests. We want to be able to pick out which of our employees are doing a good job with their security awareness versus which are the ones that could use a little bit extra training, right? Who are the ones who are just going to blindly click everything that anybody sends to them? Those are the folks we want to identify, and fish testing is a great way to do that. All right, and we've got some additional updates and tools from CISA that we'll get into next. So I mentioned CISA is the US governmental agency that is primarily responsible for cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and really the nation as a whole. I mentioned their website, cisa.gov. If you take a look, they've really got some great resources here. The Shields Up initiative is a high-level summary of much of what we're talking about in this presentation today, but really great guidance and recommendations for organizations of all shapes and sizes to shore up their security postures. CISA provides some free cybersecurity tools for organizations. So chief among these are external vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. So with those being provided as a free resource, I think it's really a great opportunity really for a lot of organizations to engage CISA for those things because they provide a lot of benefit there. Misinformation and malinformation. I already mentioned for critical infrastructure how water and energy have been frequently targeted and will likely continue to be frequently targeted. CISA's got some great resources for those types of environments, as well as incident response and vulnerability response playbooks. So I'd encourage everybody, as you can, to check these out. Really great material. Some additional CISA resources and reporting. So the CISA Cyber Resource Hub. I mentioned the technical cyber services like the vulnerability scanning and penetration testing that they offer. They've also got some non-technical cyber services that are available really to assist a wide variety of organizations. So definitely something to check out. And lastly, if you notice what you think is any suspicious cyber activity, something that just seems off to you, or you're directly observing something that represents some type of a cyber threat within your environment, a couple of great resources here to report these to the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center. And CISA's got direct contact as well. So these would be good things to make a note of and also include in your incident response plans within your organizations. All right, I think that's it for our presentation today. But if anybody has any questions or would like to chat to follow up, really we encourage you to reach out to your Corsica Technologies representative, and we look forward to talking to you in the near future.